Well, welcome to the Outlook panel session, our keynote panel discussion for today's Middle East and North Africa PPP virtual think tank. The purpose of this panel is really to provide a macro look at the PPP sector across the Middle East and North Africa, to look at some particular markets that are sort of at the forefront of the PPP agenda, and also to tease, to dive into some of the trends and opportunities and challenges that are sort of characterizing the market at the moment. Before we get started, I'd just like to introduce our four wonderful panelists who are giving us their time and expertise today. So Abraham Akawi, he is the PPP advisor for the Minister's Office at the Ministry of Finance in Oman. Welcome, Abraham. Thank you for your time. Naveed Khawaja is the PPP unit manager for the Department of Finance at the Government of Dubai. And I'll be very interested to hear, Dubai is always at the forefront of new things, and I'll be very interested to hear Naveed's update of what's going on in Dubai. Ziad Hayek, who delivered our wonderful keynote address this morning, is the president of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. Thank you, Ziad, firstly for giving us your time to join this panel, but also for your keynote address. And Munir Ferozi is the regional head for public-private partnerships, transaction advisories in the Middle East and North Africa for the International Finance Corporation. And it's fantastic to have the opportunity to have you with us today, Munir. Thank you very much for your time. So I'm going to start by coming to you, Abraham. So Oman, the government of Oman has gone through significant changes over the past couple of years, and the PPP program is right at the heart of Muscat's economic agenda. So perhaps could you, if you could perhaps just bring us up to date with where we are in Oman's PPP program at the moment. What has been the impact of what's happened over the past 18 months, both within government and COVID, but also some comments on the pipeline, the next year or two for PPP in Oman.
And I'm pleased to announce, which I have announced a few months ago, that we now have 2 waves of projects that that have been approved. The first wave is already in the market to select advisors, which took a lot longer, and I appreciate all the advisors who have been responding to our qualification, that they're patient with us, and it's been over 8 months since we launched the qualification for advisors, and now we have launched the RFPs for advisors, and I'm pleased to say they all closed. We launched 6 RFPs for 6 projects, which are our wave 1 priorities, and I'll talk about them because it's important to prepare the market to them. We have 2 in transport, 2 in health, 1 in education, and 1 in office accommodation. The transport ones, one is a truck road tolling project in Salalah Thamreit, which is linking the mining sector to the port of Salalah. It's our largest project in terms of size and capex. It's circa $1 billion in capex, and we are about to select an transaction advisor. We've received excellent proposals. We are in the process of finalizing the selection for that. The second transport project is 2 fishing ports in the ports of Liwa and Musana. The advisor already in place. We expect the tender for developer investor to be launched in August, which is in 5 weeks. Everything is in place. We are fast tracking that project given the importance of fishing in the Sultanate as well as the size of the project. We have 2 health projects that are mainly services projects, renal dialysis as well as a treatment center. They're both at the stage of having advisors in place by the end of July, and we expect the treatment center to be launched in Q3, the tendering, and the renal dialysis to be launched in Q4 of this year. So if you're a service provider in health services, get ready. We have 2 coming out this year. The second largest project in terms of capex is a bundle of schools, between 35 and 50 schools. Not very dissimilar to what the government of Saudi Arabia have done. We have launched the first bundle of schools The advisor should be in place next month, and we expect by Q4 late in the year to launch the tender document for those 40 schools.
Abraham, if I can just interrupt just briefly there. I'm interested in the schools program, but I guess this question applies to everything you've mentioned. Is the PPP for the physical infrastructure, the building the 35 school buildings, but not for the educational services? Have you separated the physical from the kind of content side?
Richard, this is the crux of the question. The advisor that we are selecting, we have excellent proposals that we received. Hopefully by the end of July, the advisor will be in place, and that exam question is being asked to the advisor. We'll give them framework in terms of should we include it and what should we include in it. The initial thought is that it doesn't include education services, but given the changes that have happened, given COVID, given too many other challenges that every country is going through, we are looking at and investigating and exploring, should we add education services, and to what extent? Is it curriculum development or curriculum delivery? All of these questions are in the scope of work.
And I presume from what little bit I know about these things, that one of the challenges with the education aspect of this is the KPIs. What are you measuring? How do you set the sort of performance targets? Whereas with the physical aspects, you can see when a building is built, and is that that's the essence of the difficulty, is it?
Well, I mean, that's one of the issues that could come on from a risk perspective. The other issue as well is the service deliverer of facility management is not typically the same service deliverer of education services. So you're marrying two potentially service providers together under a contract that has different KPIs, albeit one is linked to the physical infrastructure and one would link to services.
Okay.
I think the KPIs could be worked out. I think making sure that you incentivize the overall consortium to deliver based on one contract is going to be a challenge.
Okay.
But it's been done.
Of course. Sorry to cut you off. I know there's so much detail we can get into here, and I really wanted to quiz you, and I will do later on, about the road tolling, because that's an interesting challenge as well. And we've seen other markets in the region over the past few years have tried in that area, and it's not always been easy. So thank you for those comments, Abraham, and congratulations on your second birthday this year and the program so far. I want to move across to Naveed now. So Naveed Khawaja is the PPP unit manager at the Department of Finance in the government of Dubai. Naveed, thank you very much for your time today. Dubai is always kind of experimenting and finding new ways to do things, and it's got quite a different, as a city in its own right, or an emirate, it's quite different to the oil producers elsewhere in the GCC. So it's slightly unique. What's the latest? What is the situation? Does Dubai need PPPs, and what are the plans?
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this esteemed panel, and of course of having the opportunity to speak to this valuable audience. Richard, let me just start off with a little bit of a background of where we come from. And to point blank answer your question, yes, we are progressing a lot in terms of PPPs. And as I go forward, I'll share with you the details. So we, the Department of Finance at the government of Dubai, DOF as we call it, is the public treasury for the Dubai government. We are responsible for developing and executing the annual general budget for the government of Dubai in collaboration with government entities. We provide liquidity and also transfer the sanctioned budget allocations to the government entities. We are also responsible for the provision and the collection of the public revenues and managing the public accounts as well. So you see, we have a very holistic view of the entire financial aspirations of Dubai government. So given our strategic position and the vision of our leadership to develop Dubai into a pivotal hub in the global economy, and of course, as you said, to facilitate and fuel the ambitious goals of development in Dubai, the PPP law we had a PPP law which was published in 2015. That's law number 22 of 2015. I'm pretty sure many of the audience and you also know this, but we are the only emirate who have a dedicated PPP law. Now, this PPP law gave DOF the ability to establish a centralized public-private partnership unit to govern and to manage the Dubai government's PPP program. Now, in this capacity, we are enabling procuring entities to identify PPP projects. We're providing them financial and technical guidance to how to structure and implement these projects. And of course, the crown jewel is always developing the consolidated pipeline of projects. One thing what we have done, Richard, is that we are thoroughly involved in the entire PPP project lifecycle. So we're involved from concept approval to developing and approving bankable feasibility studies, establishing the tender documents, overseeing the bidding process, contract negotiations, contract sign-offs, implementation, and even post-implementation monitoring. Now, the reason behind this approach was that we wanted to give our partners, the sponsors, the lenders, the investors, this confidence that there was a strong governance body overseeing the entire process. So the unit has not been long for a while. It has been only 2 years almost. But however, we have progressed in leaps and bounds, to be honest. The first and foremost thing was that we set out an ambitious strategy for the PPP program, which was approved by His Highness. The next logical step was, since we already had the law, we established an emirate-wide policy and a detailed set of guidelines for all the government entities to follow in order for them to adhere to those policies and guidelines. We put in a lot of effort into these guidelines to ensure that they were in line with the international best practices and that they take into account the collective and individual experience of our team. And then we started identifying potential projects and the pipeline. And I'm very excited to say today we have a robust pipeline ready, which is spanned over different sectors such as healthcare, municipal services, road infrastructure, social development, utilities. And because Dubai has been infamous in terms of a lot of PPP projects under the power and utilities in any case. But we wanted to diversify our portfolio. So that pipeline will be published soon on our website, which will be accessible to all. And in addition to that, Richard, what really excites me is that in this limited time span, we have already brought around 4 or 5 mega projects to the market under this PPP program. The most recent one is our waste to energy project. I think everybody has read about it in the news. It's around a $1.2 billion project, a 200 megawatt facility, which is capable of treating 1.9 million tons of garbage or refuse on an annual basis. So it's a fantastic project. Then we have another project in the healthcare sector, which is a cardiology center of excellence. That when the RFP is already out and the bidding process is ongoing, and we hope to close it either by the end of this year or Q1 of 2022. The third project, which kind of coincides with what Abraham said as well, and it's very close to heart as well. It's Dubai Schools. The brand itself is Dubai Schools. I'm pretty sure the people over here must have seen a lot of social media coverage on that, even from His Highness. It's a subsidized schooling project. We already have the operator on board, and it shall start functioning from the next academic year. In addition to that, we have one district cooling assets project as well, which is also already in the market, and it is under the due diligence process. And then we have a couple of other projects in the transport sector, specifically transit-oriented developments. So you see, we have been quite busy, and of course, this global pandemic has put a revived spotlight on the PPP modality itself. So we are moving forward with a very progressive outlook, and we're exploring all the areas where we can utilize the benefits of this PPP modality. Now, recently we started exploring how to incorporate SDGs and ESGs into our cohesive program as well, because that also gives us an opportunity to tap into all those capital markets which are supporting these kind of projects.
Naveed, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Just you've raised so many points. I just want to sort of ask you questions before I forget the questions. On your final point there about ESGs and social development goals, that from an international capital markets point of view, those are key parameters, particularly the ESG sort of factors. How does that affect PPPs? Sort of PPPs traditionally are around delivering a public service with certain output targets and deadlines, etc. Where does ESG fit into that?
See, what we're doing, Richard, is we're identifying certain criteria which will help us identify projects which are able to incorporate these, the sustainability development goals and the ESGs into the overall governance framework of those projects.
So they become sort of KPIs as part of the output targets. Okay. Yeah. And then just one other question following, the question I asked to Abraham was about that separation of the operational side of a PPP with the infrastructure part of it. And two of the PPPs you mentioned there were schools and healthcare. It sounded like you were saying that you've made the decision that the schools one, you have an operator for the educational services, so the PPP is for the physical assets. Is that correct on the school side?
See, it's a mix actually, because we already had the physical assets, and the operator is coming in with the entire management and running the school. In addition to that, maintaining the overall facility management as well. So it's a mix basically. So he's not only running the curriculum, but he's also running the facility management as well.
So sorry, my misunderstanding. So the operator is the PPP contract.
Exactly.
I thought you'd said the operator was already in. Sorry, my misunderstanding. Yeah. I apologize. And then on the other side, you mentioned healthcare as well. Is that for the operational aspects, or is that both construction and operation?
That one is a little bit interesting. That is more towards the construction and the equipment provision, and in addition to having a like a clinical partner. However, the operations would be still with us. But that one is more towards the physical infrastructure on its own. Okay,
perfect. Naveed, thank you very much for your comments there. We shall come back into more of that in a moment, but thank you, Naveed, for just now. Ziad Hayek, you are the president of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. Thank you again for delivering the keynote comments this morning. I guess you would have you're not neutral on this, but one question is, do we really need PPP units, dedicated PPP units, or even dedicated PPP laws? So I guess you're not neutral on that topic, but I think that's an interesting general question. So perhaps you could comment on that. But what are your feelings on how things have changed over the past 18 months? How has political will been affected? Are we now seeing an acceleration of the shift to PPP in the Middle East and North Africa? And then from the investor side, are people's budgets a bit squeezed now to start investing, or are people sitting on huge stockpiles of cash and they're ready to go?
Well, many questions.
Yeah, sorry.
But let me start by saying that I'm delighted to be here. I thank you for putting me on a panel with Abraham, with Munir, and with Naveed. All three of them top PPP professionals for whom I have the highest respect. And for that, in my opening remarks, I mentioned Uzbekistan having retained a senior advisor to help the PPP unit. I failed to mention Oman, and of course, Abraham has been playing a key role. Munir has been around for a long time, has been instrumental in many successes in PPP in the region. And I'm delighted to hear Naveed talk about ESG and SDGs, because this is exactly what WAP stands for and what we are trying to promote. It's a major thing for us in WAP. For those, if you allow me to say a few words about WAP.
Of course.
We are the global association for PPP practitioners, both public and private. And we have two main objectives. One objective is to look out for the interests of our members, so for their career development, for PPP units to find consultants and investors, for investors to find projects, for people to find jobs who are involved in PPP, consultants to find. So we're a networking hub. And the second thing we do is we advocate for what we call next level PPP. So this is PPP that is, looking what I always say, and as I said in my opening remarks, it's a tool for development. So with that, I go back to answering your specific questions about yes, I mean it is really growing in importance. The problem in the region is that because they're different countries with different systems and different backgrounds, it's apples and oranges. We have I think the good point is that some countries, especially in the Gulf region, are getting their act together, and they are starting to. They have some experience they're building on. The problem exists in other parts of the region where there's always changes. They change the legal framework. They update or amend the laws several times. They set up a PPP unit and then they disband it. They put it in this ministry and then in this other ministry, and they hire some top professionals and then they let them go. So political interference is a major problem in a number of countries.
Actually, if I can, sorry to interrupt, Ziad, just on that point about political interference, it strikes me that one of the major challenges for PPP and privatization over the past many years in this region is that political will. There's a lot of statements at a high level about we intend to do this, but outside of the utilities sector, it's not really been pushed, in my opinion, to get some of these projects over the line. Is it your sense that that has changed, that there is now more political will, perhaps because of COVID and the fiscal impact, or Vision 2030 in places like Saudi Arabia? Has the paradigm changed, in your opinion, in the last couple of years?
I mean, if I'm talking about the entire MENA region and sort of generalizing, I would say no.
Okay.
I don't think it has changed. I think politicians are still politicians. They still have very little understanding of PPP. Unfortunately, I think the PPP units are not doing a very good job of elevating the political system. They're not doing a good job necessarily of bringing people from the outside to lobby for them and to educate politicians. I give you an example. When I was heading the PPP unit in Lebanon, I had some people from IFC, Lawrence Carter and Nigel Harris, who came over and they, we organized lunches with our members of parliament, and those meetings with members of parliament were very instrumental in getting, some of the things to start get going on the right direction. And I think these kind of informal meetings with parliamentarians, with ministers, like I said in my opening remarks, they're not going to sit in a PPP training program, but you need to have a conversation from a senior person to them and guide them in the right direction. This is the only way, really. Otherwise, they're always going to be thinking, putting pressure on the PPP unit. Why isn't this done yet? Yeah. Why don't you have the project? And this is a major problem.
It does. But as you said, we're not dealing with a single homogenous market. Every country's got its own situation, and Abraham has clearly described that in Oman there is a clear program, a political drive behind it. Same with Naveed in Dubai and Saudi, and we see it in a number of. But then you look at Lebanon or you look at Kuwait, and it's a completely different political landscape. So, you mentioned Lebanon. Yeah.
You mind if I say a couple of more words regarding investors?
Of course.
Because I think this is very important. What we tend to see in the region is a lot of companies that are very keen to get PPP projects. There's a lot of hunger among especially strategic investors to get a deal. And so they are willing to go and bid on a deal that is not well structured, that is, they figure they will work things out later on. When you see a deal where you have a lot of, especially like local investors coming in without international investors, I think you should start getting worried, because it means that it's not of the quality that is attracting top-level companies around the world. And this means that the deals get awarded, but then they fail later on. They fail in performance. They fail in KPIs. And that causes a bad image for PPP in those communities. And this is something we really need to avoid. So I know I sound like a school teacher or like a priest, preaching, saying, please do the right thing. But I really believe investors have a responsibility to not bid on projects that are not well structured.
So this is something that I think has been quite a major conversation over the past few years, that kind of producing bankable projects that will attract investors. And part of that has been about transparency, about data, a track record. I mean, that takes a long time. Have we seen changes there, or are investors now sort of trusting the data that they can get?
I wouldn't have first-hand information to answer that question.
Okay. In your, just briefly before I move on to Munir, so you talked about there is investor appetite. Are there particular sectors where appetite exists? So the energy sector is clearly, very mature for IWPPs and IPPs, and we're seeing that development of renewables and water and wastewater emerging, I think, there as well. But what about other areas, healthcare, education, transport? Where do you think the best opportunities will be?
Look, I don't, I mean, companies are going to be interested in whatever field they are. They can't be interested in a field they're not involved with. And it's going to depend on a country by country where they find those opportunities. So I don't think one can generalize about that. But what I can say is that outside the heavy infrastructure, when you look at the social infrastructure, there is little experience among companies in general, especially in our region, in delivering those types of projects. So building a school building, yes, that's easy, but actually putting together a curriculum and the infrastructure that is required nowadays with digital learning, and that is something completely different, and there are very few companies that are able to deliver this. The same thing with healthcare, the same thing with other things. Yeah. So I think the important thing is going to be how to structure projects that can attract the right type of service providers, especially in social services.
Okay. Ziad, thank you for your comments there. I apologize for the sort of technical problems in the middle, but very much appreciated. I'd like to move on now to Munir Ferozi. Munir is the Regional Head for Public-Private Partnerships Transaction Advisory in the Middle East and North Africa for the International Finance Corporation. Munir, thank you for your patience. We've gone round the panel. Now, from IFC's point of view, obviously you have very much a sort of region-wide perspective rather than a particular country. So I'm interested in your views on how you've seen things change over the past 18 months. What has been the impact of COVID, and what is have we unlocked new potential with these new units that are being created? What do you think?
Well, thanks a lot, first of all, Richard. Great to see all the colleagues, friends, people in the audience. Just a little bit of context, as Richard mentioned, I cover the transaction advisory business for PPPs in MENA region, and most of our clients are the government sector clients, so we're looking at sell-side advisory. So from that perspective, I think infrastructure being a very political economy business, I have a good pulse of what is happening in the region. So perhaps if I can take a stock of what happened in the last 18 months, and then what do I see in the future? So if you look at the last, I would say 15, 18 months, COVID has been a black swan event. It's a once in a life global pandemic. And the impact of that has really been a slowdown of pipelines, slowdown of procurement, reprioritization of projects, because the governments were busy in that interim period doing a health emergency response. So from that perspective, some of the sectors have been impacted. Transport is a classic one, whereby you cannot really predict what the air traffic would be or the road traffic would be when you have global lockdowns. Having said that, we also see the emergence of new sectors such as health, education, digital infrastructure, online learning, those kind of things. Making sure the broadband is more readily available. I think also the investor interest and appetite has changed somewhat in the last 15 months as well, because there's obviously a kind of an impact on what happens in a force majeure situation. How will this contract be balanced or not balanced? What sort of a partnership mode will the government take? So I think the PPP model, in my view, has changed in all the three streams, right? Planning, execution, and procurement, right? What do I mean by that? In the planning stage, maybe the government should look at the reprioritization of the projects in terms of what are the national priorities and link it to the investor appetite and interest, perhaps starting with the smaller projects first and then sort of building the track record. I think on the structuring side, a lot more flexibility is required in terms of structuring the projects to have the ability to rebalance in shorter intervals. So, we don't know how the traffic will evolve, for instance, in the airport market, right? But if you have a short-term bite-size flexibility in terms of rebalancing that contract, then you can make it more bankable. And I think the partnership is key, right? Particularly in difficult times, if you look at the feedback from the investors and the market, it's really, the contracts and the countries which are going to flourish in this sector are the countries which are respecting the partnership aspect of the public-private partnerships. And I think on the procurement side, you need to have more resilient contracts. So, you need to define force majeure situations much more clearly rather than just have the standard force majeure or material adverse government action kind of clauses, right? You need to have a lot more flexibility in terms of, both the upside and the downside of the contracts, right? So that, both the private sector and the public sector come into this in sort of a partnership mode. And I think you need to
Majeure, if I can just ask you on that force majeure question, it's quite interesting. Yeah. You called for less sort of standard, more detailed or sophisticated or nuanced clauses around force majeure. But whose responsibility is that? Is that the government offering the contract, or is it because presumably the operator or the PPP partner, that's their risk, isn't it? If they're taking it on, then force majeure is a risk. Pandemics are a risk. Who's responsible for sort of defining that clause?
So look, I think I look at the responsibility of both the private sector and the public sector. This needs to be defined and co-defined, and also the advisors who that come in to advise on these transactions. This is completely a new chapter in terms of contracting, right? And I think there's a lot of work that is going on. So, for instance, the World Bank is coming up with a guidance note in the summer in terms of, how do we make more resilient PPP contracts, right? And, just watch the space on that. But just as a layman, right, I'm not a lawyer, just as a layman, as I said, you need to have the flexibility to make sure that there is a rebalancing at certain intervals, right, depending on the project. There is a flexibility to introduce, cure periods or, suspension periods. There is a flexibility to ensure that the upside and the downside is appropriately defined. And I think the risk allocation around that is going to change as well. Okay. So let me then now move to, your question in terms of where the pipeline and what's happening. So I talked about the last 15 months. Yeah. And I think let's talk about, what the future is, right? And there's a lot of discussion we've had on this as well. So the way I see is, last 15 months has been an emergency response, right? I think with the fiscal stress in the government's balance sheets, particularly if you talk outside of GCC, if you look across the region, I think we are pretty much at 100% debt to GDP, give or take, right? There's not much space to build on, infrastructure through public spending, which basically means the governments will be forced to, and they are being forced to think about a lot more PPPs, right? That is already happening. So we've talked about the GCC, so maybe let me complement what I see. And I think, Richard, you talked about the MEED report with $242 billion of projects, 223 billion, and 240 odd projects. And we've talked about GCC, so let's talk about Egypt. Egypt has just announced 9 new projects, both in the desal sector as well as in the ports. I'm seeing a lot more activity. We are advising the government of Jordan. There are 3 projects which the investors should expect in the next 6 to 12 months coming to the market. So we've done the structuring of that. So one is the schools PFI project, which is going to be a pilot, but we expect that to be a program. So we're doing 50 schools now, but the ambition is to do 600 schools over the next 5-10 years. So that's quite big. And the total size of that is about $2 billion. And the second project that we're doing in Jordan is a bridge crossing between Palestine and Jordan. Again, very key project, transportation project, but one needs to look at all the aspects that I talked about. And the third project we have is a broadband project. Again, talking to the digital infrastructure and making sure that there's much more reach around that, right? Morocco has just announced $3 billion of PPP project. They changed the PPP law. It's become more nimble in terms of what to expect from that perspective. We talked about Oman. Ibrahim talked about that. We talked about the UAE. Of course, let's not forget Saudi. Saudi has a very, very big pipeline of PPP projects. And the transition that I see is, a lot of energy generation projects have been taking place. So we've gone first generation, second generation, and now the third generation on the renewables, right? I think we need to now, and I feel that's a turning point to look at the other sectors as well. They have been very sporadic.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, in terms of finance that's available, it's in standard verticals, energy is quite distinct from transport, is quite distinct from education, and is quite distinct from healthcare, etc. In terms of PPP, are they all trying to draw funds from the same pots of money, or are there different pools of finance for energy projects, for healthcare projects? How are we sort of just chasing the same money?
So look, I think as Ziad kind of alluded to that, right? There are different investors for different sectors, right? Because that's their core business. But in terms of
banks are the same, though.
The banking liquidity is obviously it's fungible, right? As long as you put together a well-structured project, I think there will be liquidity. The issue that I have seen in the market is lenders have become accustomed to standard IPP, IWPP kind of structures. And we tried to change that when we did the Medina Airport project, introducing the market risk as well.
But this is the with power and water, you have a feedstock supplier, which is the government, and you have an off-taker, which is the government, and it can all be neatly parceled up. Yeah. This is where the other track record and data undermines these other sectors, isn't it? I mean, we still have that fundamental problem, don't we?
No, absolutely right, Richard. And this is really where the shift of the market needs to take place. Talking about the schools project, for instance, Ibrahim talked about it, Naveed talked about it as well. That's an availability payment structure, right? You have the project available, schools available, you get paid. I think where the market needs to move, and this is going to be a transition, is all these projects which do not have the guaranteed offtake, and you're taking some risk around that as well. But this is going to be a long transition period. And let me also touch upon what you asked, Ziad, in terms of where is the market heading to in terms of the political will, right? I think this is a work in progress. Ziad is absolutely right. For PPP projects to succeed, and we've seen that in this region as well, you need longevity of decision making, and you need political commitment. And if you continue to change governments in a particular country, or you don't have the government, then the investor appetite is dampened, right? So we need to have that. Second thing we need to have is also, if you want to have a program of PPPs, then a PPP law is necessary, but you need to build the capacity of the government counterparts as well. That's also lacking, right? And there is you can put them through any training you want, right? And the series of training. There is nothing that you can do which will build the capacity except for rolling up your sleeves and actually doing the projects. And there we have not seen much of that. So we need to do that as well. And lastly, I should say, we've talked about it a lot as well, is to make sure there is a transparent procurement process. There's a lot of money that the investors spend on, particularly on the large projects, and they want to make sure that at least they have a fair share at it. So let me stop there. A long-winded way of answering your question.
That was fantastic. That was fantastic, Munir. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to rush to Ibrahim again. Now, Ibrahim, a question that has come in from the audience about PPP in Oman. Who is responsible for PPP transactions in Oman? Is there a centralized unit for each ministry? Well, we know that there's a centralized unit. You've already described it, but how does that relationship work with the centralized unit and each ministry, and who's managing the actual transactions?
Richard, and whoever asked the question, the PPP law is very specific. The PPP law is centralizing everything within the authority that's now part of the Ministry of Finance, except in the power sector. This is a specific power sector purchasing company That's different. Every project PPP in Oman, as the law stands, has to go through the PPP entity, which is the centralized entities. The ministries are part of every project as a working group. So we have for every project I mentioned and others, a working group led by the Ministry of Finance.
Okay, so it's pretty clear. It's the central unit. It's the Ministry of Finance.
Central unit. Now, we are looking, as other countries have done, for what I call small, simple projects below a certain threshold, circa $10–15 million a year, $15 million of capex, $500,000 of OPEX a year. They may have a different track because, we want to look at the sizable projects. But in Oman, the law says the Ministry of Finance is responsible for executing, processing all the PPPs.
Okay, thank you. Now, I said I was going to ask you about the road tolling proposal. We've had it, particularly in the UAE, that's been, there was, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, there was a road PPP that struggled. It strikes me that that's quite a difficult area. I guess you can't predict traffic and things like that. What's the situation with the PPP? What is the road PPP that you're talking about, and do you have any details on how that will work?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's a truck road from the mining sector in Thumrait. It's 110 kilometers long between Thumrait and Salalah port. It's to transport mining products. As Munir said, these are the ones that are the toughest because of volume risk. Who's taking the volume risk? Can we shift all of it, part of it, none of it to the private sector? Because if we keep continuing doing availability-based payment PPPs, we haven't accomplished much. So therefore, part of this toll road, and we have done a pre-feasibility on it, so we have some indication on traffic. How guaranteed is that traffic? It depends on the economy. So as Munir said, as my other esteemed colleagues have said, we need to find a way to flex these PPP projects, to make them flexible, to make them resilient to economic uptake and downturn in the economy, whereby, for example, and this is not for this project, for other projects I've done in other parts of the world, whereby the government can guarantee for a certain period of time, certain volumetric. And then if it doesn't happen, then we put our hand in the pocket and pay for it.
Okay, so I was going to ask exactly that question. Two or three people have mentioned flexibility, and I didn't know what that meant. But it means the government will underwrite a certain amount if certain levels haven't been hit.
Underwrite is a very strong word. We'll make a presentation. So yes, there will be certain topping up if the volumetric is not there for a period of time, not forever.
Okay.
So those are the exam questions that we're asking the advisors to advise on. What is that time? What is the volume currently? And I'll tell you something that's public. We have 7,000 trucks that go back and forth, 3,000 one way and 3,000 the other way on that road. Based on the pre-feasibility, it seems to be very viable. And these are heavy trucks. We're not talking about sedans and private cars. So based on that, based on the savings they're going to get from taking the new road, they're going to save an hour and a half. That saving itself in terms of fuel cost, repair cost, and labor cost should be
okay
more than enough to pay the toll.
Okay, so what if I try and summarize, this whole discussion is about shifting risk from the state to the private investor, and over the past 18 months, we've seen this increased uncertainty around the economic side of things because of COVID, and so force majeure being more nuanced and subtle on that is one lesson, and as you've just mentioned, flexibility around the partnership, the government perhaps de-risking a little bit. So those are the two things that I've picked up so far today. There's one other thing that's I think is emerging on the horizon, and it's this issue of inflation and rising costs that we're seeing around the world. Abraham, if I can ask you first, and then I'll come to Naveed second. Is that a concern for governments trying to implement PPP, that there's now this price escalation that may be long-term, it may be a structural thing, it may just be a short-term reaction to bottleneck constraints. Is inflation a concern?
Of course, it's a concern, but inflation has got twofold of impact. The first impact is on the capital spend. That's the short term. That could be hedged to some extent. The bigger inflation risk is on the longer term, on the O&M side of the equation. Most PPPs that have availability-based payment have an indexation in them. So you capture that inflation, which is unknown. Nobody's going to take the risk of 25 years on inflation on O&M. And most PPPs that have been involved in, I've seen, have an indexation. Is the indexation the right indexation? Does it cover the basket of services? That's the other question. Okay. So I think that's part of the risking that has been in place forever on PPPs.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibrahim. Naveed, if I can come to you with that same point really about the future risks. We've talked about pipeline and future opportunities. At MEED, we're looking a lot about that kind of the spike in raw materials costs and long-term, short-term inflation risk. And I guess interest rates, the central bank response to inflation would be interest rates going up. What's your view on that, and how does that affect sort of PPP planning, or at least appetite for PPP projects?
As Ibrahim said as well, inflation risk is a pertinent risk. However, what we try our best is to index it properly. And the most important thing, which I think Munir also touched upon, is that the planning stage for the PPP projects needs to be very resilient, very strong. And that is one of our key focuses, which we're doing currently. We have a very strong focus during the planning stage. We make sure that the feasibility study is accomplished in a way that it leads to a bankable project. And the risk allocations are also balanced. That's the most important thing. Because what I personally have noticed in my limited experience, I'm not as experienced as these great gentlemen, but in my limited experience, what I've seen is that generally what happens is when the PPP modality comes into the mind, the government wishes to push all the risks to the private sector, and that leads to an unbalanced approach, and whereby eventually the projects fail. So this is one thing which we as the PPP unit, we're really focusing on this, and we want to make sure that we have long-lasting partnerships with our investors and lenders. And as I said, in our feasibility studies, the most important thing is to make sure that there is a proper identification, allocation of these risks, including even the force majeure aspect, which Munir mentioned, especially with the COVID situation. This is something which we witnessed last year, and we were during that phase. We were already in the pipeline of issuing certain RFPs to the market, and in our project agreements, we have made sure to capture this element of the pandemic or the global crisis as part of the force majeure, because at the end of the day, it's a natural existing disaster kind of a thing. So nobody has any control on it, and you cannot just leave the private sector or your partner high and dry, because at the end of the day, they are called public-private partnerships. So let's treat them as partners rather than just enforcing them to do things for us.
Fantastic. That's a great way to bring the conversation to a close. We've probably overrun our time a little bit, but there's such a lot of content to get through. Thank you very much to all four of you, to Ziad, Ibrahim, Munir, and Naveed for your comments. It's quite clear to me that we're seeing a definite shift, improvement in the pipeline, the planning, the infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure to deliver these projects. But there are still some of those roadblocks that we've had around bankability, political will, and also new challenges from COVID that we've discussed. So a lot of food for thought. Thank you, gentlemen.